Imagine standing in Britain and looking across a landscape that continues, almost uninterrupted, all the way to Canada. No cities, no highways, no forests covering the horizon, just grass, cold wind, and enormous herds of mammoths, horses, bison, and reindeer stretching farther than you could see. This was the Mammoth Steppe, one of the largest ecosystems Earth has ever produced. And then, almost unbelievably, it disappeared. The strange part isn't that the animals vanished. It's that the world supporting them vanished with them. Most people picture the Ice Age as a frozen wasteland, a place of endless white silence, empty and lifeless, buried under ice from one horizon to the other. That picture is almost entirely wrong. For most of the last Ice Age, a huge belt of the northern hemisphere wasn't buried under ice at all, because it was simply too dry for ice sheets to form there in the first place. Instead, that belt was covered in grass, cold, dry, wind-scoured grass, but grass all the same. And grass changes absolutely everything about what a landscape can support. Where there is grass, there are grazers, and where there are grazers in numbers this large, there is an entire living world built around them, layer upon layer of animals, depending on soil. This was not a frozen desert in any meaningful sense of the word. It was, by almost every measure that matters, one of the richest habitats that has ever existed on the surface of this planet. To understand the scale of it, you have to stop thinking in terms of countries and start thinking in terms of continents stitched together as one. The Mammoth Steppe began somewhere around the British Isles, back when Britain was not an island at all, but simply the low, western edge of a vast continental plain that never noticed where a coastline would one day be drawn. From there it rolled eastward across what is now France, then Germany, then Poland, without slowing down or changing character in any serious way. It swallowed the entire breadth of Ukraine and western Russia as though those distances were nothing at all. It crossed Siberia, one of the widest land masses on Earth, without a single major break in the grass, the cold, or the herds moving across it. And then, at the point where today there is nothing but open, freezing ocean separating two continents, it kept going regardless. A wide strip of land connected Siberia directly to Alaska in those centuries, exposed because so much of the planet's water was locked away inside ice sheets that global sea levels dropped low enough for the seabed itself to become dry, walkable ground. The grassland crossed that bridge too, spilling out of Asia and into North America, running down through Alaska and into the Yukon, deep into what would one day be called Canada. One biome, one continuous, unbroken strip of grass, wind, and animals, wrapping nearly a third of the way around the entire planet without a single true border interrupting it. Try to hold that scale in your mind for a moment, because it rarely gets said out loud in quite these terms. This was not a large habitat in the way we usually mean large when we talk about national parks or nature reserves today. This was an ecosystem you could, in theory, have walked across for years and never once left its borders. A single grazing herd could have wandered from a hillside in modern-day Britain to a river valley in modern-day Canada and never once stepped outside the biome that raised it, fed it, and sheltered its young. No ocean crossing was needed for most of that unimaginable journey. No dense forest blocked the way at any point along that route. No towering mountain range closed the corridor off entirely from end to end. It was, in the truest and strangest sense of the word, simply one world, undivided. And it was not empty in the slightest. It was staggeringly, almost impossibly full of life. Picture the ground first, because absolutely everything else depended on what was happening beneath the surface. The soil across the Mammoth Steppe was unusually rich for a landscape this cold, built up over centuries from fine, mineral-heavy dust that blew constantly off the crumbling edges of nearby glaciers and settled across the plains in thick, fertile layers. That dust became some of the most productive ground on Earth, capable of supporting a volume of plant growth that the raw temperature of the climate alone would never suggest was possible. On top of that soil grew not moss, not lichen, not the sparse and tough vegetation most people associate with modern Arctic tundra, but dense, nutrient-rich grasses and flowering herbs, endlessly refreshed by the very same mineral dust that had built the soil in the first place. This was the hidden engine sitting quietly underneath everything else in the story. Rich ground fed rich grass, and rich grass meant something almost impossible to picture today. An Ice Age landscape capable of feeding more large mammals per square mile than the modern Serengeti manages in the height of an African summer. Now bring in the animals themselves, because this is exactly where the scale becomes genuinely difficult to describe in words alone. Woolly mammoths moved across the open plains in tight, cooperative family groups, enormous, tusked, shaggy-coated giants capable of stripping bark, pulling up buried roots, and knocking over any young sapling before it ever had the chance to take hold. Their sheer size and constant, restless movement helped keep the grassland open by physically trampling anything that tried to turn it into forest. Alongside them moved woolly rhinoceroses, armored in thick hide and heavy layered fur, grazing calmly through conditions that would kill most modern animals within a matter of days. Herds of wild horses swept across the open ground in numbers that would be genuinely unthinkable today, built for speed and long-distance endurance across flat, unbroken terrain that seemed almost purpose-built for exactly that kind of movement. Steppe bison, heavier and more powerfully built than any bison alive today, moved in herds so vast that a human observer standing on any nearby ridge would have struggled to count them from horizon to horizon. Reindeer and their close relatives crossed the plains in seasonal migrations that dwarf anything found in the modern Arctic, following the same ancient rhythm of grass and cold that shaped every other creature living within this world. Herds of saiga antelope, strange and long-nosed, moved in tight, nervous clusters across the driest stretches of the plain, built for exactly the kind of dust-laden wind that defined this landscape. On the far western edge of the biome, where the grassland finally crossed into North America and pushed down through Alaska and the Yukon toward the heart of Canada, the herds took on an even stranger character that most people never associate with this continent at all. Wild camels, taller and more heavily built than anything found in a desert today, moved across the frozen grassland in small, scattered groups, perfectly at home on cold, open plains rather than sand. Herds of native North American horses, the direct ancestors of animals that would later vanish from this continent entirely before eventually returning centuries afterward, grazed alongside mammoths and steppe bison as though the boundary between Asia and North America had never existed in the first place, which, for most of that period, it effectively hadn't. Muskoxen moved in tight, defensive circles along the coldest margins of the range, thick-coated and low to the ground, built to weather storms that would have killed almost anything else standing in the open. The entire western half of the Mammoth Steppe, the Canadian half, carried its own particular mixture of giants, every bit as strange and every bit as full as the herds moving across Britain and Siberia thousands of miles behind them. None of it looked like the Canada or the Alaska we picture today. All of it belonged to the very same unbroken world. And where there is that much prey moving across that much open ground, there are predators built specifically to match it. Cave lions, larger and considerably more powerful than the lions of Africa today, stalked the open plains, built for hunting animals capable of outrunning almost anything else alive at the time. Packs of ancient wolves moved alongside the herds across enormous distances, following mammoths and wild horses the way modern wolves follow caribou, except across a landscape roughly 10 times the size of anything a modern pack could ever hope to patrol. Enormous short-faced bears, taller than an adult human when raised onto their hind legs, move through the margins of this world, powerful enough to challenge almost any animal they happen to come across. This was not, in any sense, a quiet or frozen landscape. It was loud, restless, and constantly in motion. It was full of hooves and breath and dust, herds shifting like slow-moving weather systems across a plain with no visible end, predators trailing patiently behind them like storms that never quite broke. Here's the part that tends to surprise people the most. This ecosystem wasn't simply cold enough, by pure accident, to survive the harsh conditions of the Ice Age. It was actively built and maintained by its own animals, caught in a loop that renewed itself, without fail, every single year. Grazing animals in numbers this staggering don't just passively live on top of a grassland. They actively maintain it through their own constant presence. Every hoofprint that breaks through the surface of fresh snow lets more cold air reach directly down into the soil, keeping the ground frozen and structurally stable underneath. Every single bite of grass keeps shrubs and young trees from ever gaining a foothold, because grass recovers quickly from heavy grazing while slower-growing woody plants simply cannot keep pace. Every pile of dung returns nutrients straight back into the soil, feeding the next generation of grass before the current growth has even finished for the season. Millions of animals moving constantly across millions of acres created one enormous, self-reinforcing cycle that fed itself indefinitely. Grass fed the animals, and the animals, in turn, maintained the grass, and the grass kept the ground cold, dry, and stable in exactly the way the entire system depended on to keep functioning. Remove enough of the animals from that loop, even briefly, and the entire machine stops working, not gradually over centuries, but shockingly, alarmingly fast. That single detail matters more than almost anything else in this entire story, so hold on to it carefully, because it quietly explains everything that happens next. Humans lived inside this world too, though not remotely in the way most people imagine when they picture life during the Ice Age. They weren't isolated survivors clinging desperately to the edges of some hostile, frozen wasteland, scraping together a living against impossible odds. They were simply part of the ecosystem, following the very same herds that the predators followed, reading the very same seasonal patterns, moving across the very same unbroken plains that stretched from one side of the hemisphere all the way to the other. Groups of people crossed the Bering Land bridge the same way horses and bison did before them, walking across a route that has sat underwater for thousands of years now, following grass and prey rather than any fixed or planned destination in mind. For a population that depended entirely on enormous herds of migratory animals for food, clothing, and shelter, the Mammoth Steppe wasn't a barrier standing in the way of movement across the top of the world. It was the very reason movement across the top of the world was possible at all. And then, over the course of only a few thousand years, which sounds achingly slow to us but barely registers as a blink in geological time, this entire, magnificent system began to quietly fall apart. The trigger wasn't some sudden catastrophe arriving without warning, but something far quieter, and in its own strange way, something far more unsettling, as the climate began, slowly at first, to warm. Ice sheets that had locked away enormous volumes of the world's water for tens of thousands of years started to melt, and as they melted, more and more moisture entered the atmosphere above the plains. More moisture in the air meant more snowfall on the ground below, and this is exactly where the quiet part of the story turns dangerous. Thick, soft, wet snow behaves in a completely different way from the thin, wind-packed snow that had blanketed the Mammoth Steppe for tens of thousands of uninterrupted years. Thin snow lets grazing animals push through it with relative ease to reach the grass buried underneath, but thick, wet snow simply does not allow that. It buries the entire food source beneath a barrier that animals cannot break through in anywhere near the numbers they need to survive a single hard winter. At almost exactly the same time, that rising moisture allowed something else to begin creeping in from the margins of the biome, something the old, dry, wind-scoured Mammoth Steppe had never once been wet enough to support. Moss first, then low shrubs, and eventually, slowly but relentlessly, trees. Where the climate had once been far too dry and far too cold for anything but tough, resilient grass to dominate the landscape, it was now just wet enough for slower growing, far less nutritious vegetation to take hold, patch by stubborn patch, at exactly the edges where constant grazing pressure had once kept it firmly out. This is precisely where the story shifts from simply tragic to genuinely strange. It wasn't only that the animals began to struggle under these new conditions. It was that their struggling actively made everything else worse, feeding directly back into the very same collapse that was already underway. Remember the loop described earlier, because this is where it turns against itself. Grazing animals had been the ones keeping the ground cold, keeping grass dominant across the plain, keeping shrubs and trees from ever gaining a real foothold anywhere within the system. As herds began shrinking under the combined pressure of buried food and a rapidly shifting climate, there were fewer hooves left to break up the snow, fewer mouths left to keep the encroaching shrubs in check, fewer bodies left to return nutrients to the soil in that same relentless cycle that had sustained the whole system for tens of thousands of years. The very engine that had originally built and maintained the grassland was now slowing down at the precise moment the grassland needed it most desperately. Less grazing allowed even more moss and shrub to spread outward from the margins. More moss and shrub insulated the ground beneath it, trapping warmth instead of releasing it the way bare, grazed earth once had, which allowed the permafrost underneath to soften in places it had never softened before. Softer, wetter ground supported even less of the specific grass species the great migratory herds had always depended on for survival. Fewer of those grasses meant that even fewer animals could realistically be supported across the same stretch of land. And fewer animals, in turn, meant even less grazing pressure left to hold back the shrubs and trees now advancing steadily from every direction at once. Around and around it went, each full turn of the cycle making the next turn measurably worse, until an ecosystem that had thrived, essentially unchanged, for tens of thousands of years began quietly unraveling within only a few thousand. Here is the detail that should genuinely unsettle you more than anything else in this story. Even in places where the surrounding climate itself would still have been perfectly capable of supporting healthy grassland, the biome did not return once the animals sustaining it were gone. This wasn't simply a case of the weather changing and the landscape changing neatly alongside it in a straight, predictable line. The animals themselves had been holding the entire ecosystem in a state that the surrounding climate alone could never have produced or maintained on its own, no matter how favorable the temperature happened to be. Take away enough of those animals, and the world doesn't just shift gently toward a slightly different balance. It collapses instead into an entirely different kind of landscape altogether, one that, once firmly established, actively resists ever-changing back, almost as though a door propped open for tens of thousands of years had finally swung shut and quietly locked itself behind it for good. Species by species, the great herds that had defined this world for so long began disappearing from region after region, in a slow, rolling wave that took thousands of years to fully complete. Woolly mammoths held on the longest, scattered into small, isolated pockets on remote islands, and in the most untouched corners of what remained, distant, dwindling echoes of herds that had once stretched from one edge of an entire continent to another without a break. Woolly rhinoceroses vanished almost entirely from landscapes their ancestors had grazed for tens of thousands of unbroken generations before them. Cave lions, which had hunted across the open plains for as long as anyone could reasonably trace, lost the very prey base that had made them among the most powerful predators the world had ever produced, and disappeared alongside it, region by region, until none remained anywhere. One by one, the great architects of the grassland were quietly removed from the very system they themselves had built and sustained, and one by one, the shrubs and forests that grass and hooves had held firmly at bay for so long finally moved in, uncontested, to take their place across the plain. What eventually replaced the Mammoth Steppe wasn't nothing at all. It was something far quieter, considerably smaller in scale, and unmistakably far less alive than what had come before it. In place of an unbroken grassland capable of feeding herds beyond any reasonable counting, the northern world split apart into scattered, disconnected fragments. Cold, wet tundra took over the far north, now dominated by moss and low shrubs instead of grass, capable of supporting only a small fraction of the animal life the old system had once carried across the very same ground. Dense boreal forest crept steadily across huge stretches of what had once been open plain, transforming a landscape originally built for enormous migratory herds into one far better suited to smaller, more solitary animals moving quietly through trees rather than sweeping openly across visible horizons. The unified, continuous biome that had once run without interruption from the edge of Britain all the way to the heart of Canada broke apart permanently into disconnected patches, none of them anywhere near large enough or rich enough to ever recreate what the whole system had lost. And Britain itself, the very starting point of this entire story, is perhaps the clearest possible example of just how completely and thoroughly the transformation eventually took hold. The open grassland that had once stretched from British hillsides all the way toward the distant Ural Mountains is entirely gone from that landscape today, replaced first by dense forest over thousands of years, and far more recently by farmland, towns, and cities sitting directly on top of ground that once supported herds of mammoths moving through in the thousands. Nothing about the modern landscape offers even the faintest hint of what used to stand there. No sweeping open plain remains visible anywhere, no sense of a horizon that simply keeps going without end. The transformation was so total, so complete, that without deliberately looking into the deeper record buried beneath it, no one would ever guess that Britain had once served as the western doorway into one of the largest ecosystems this entire planet has ever managed to produce. Here's something worth sitting with quietly for a moment, because it genuinely changes how the whole story feels once it settles in. This wasn't simply the story of a handful of species dying out, the kind of familiar extinction story that gets told again and again about the Ice Age without much variation. This was the loss of an entire functioning world, a complete and self-contained ecosystem with its own internal logic, its own self-sustaining cycles, and its own almost unimaginable scale that dwarfs nearly everything alive on the planet today. When the last of the great herds finally thinned out and the grazing engine at the heart of it all stalled for good, it didn't just take individual species down along with it. It took down the very conditions that had made those species possible in the first place. And those exact conditions have never fully returned, not even once, in all the thousands of years that have passed since. There is a final, almost haunting detail buried inside this collapse that rarely gets the attention it deserves. On a handful of small, remote islands scattered along the far northern coastline, cut off from the mainland by rising seas at the very same time the great grassland was unraveling everywhere else, tiny populations of woolly mammoths managed to survive for thousands of years after their mainland relatives had already vanished completely. Isolated from the shrinking herds, isolated from the collapsing grassland engine that once sustained animals on a continental scale, these last remaining island mammoths lived on quietly in miniature, a shrunken, dwindling echo of a population that had once numbered in the millions and roamed across a third of the entire northern hemisphere. They were not thriving. They were simply the last coals of a fire that had once burned across 3 continents, glowing faintly in isolation long after the great blaze itself had gone out everywhere around them. Even that final flicker eventually failed, and when it did, it closed the very last chapter of a story that had begun in the open plains of Ice Age Britain and ended on a windswept island most people alive today have never even heard of. It helps, at this point, to compare the sheer scale of what was lost to something more familiar. The great wildlife reserves people travel across the world to visit today, the sweeping plains of East Africa, filled with migrating wildebeest and zebra, are treated as the last truly wild places left on Earth, vast beyond anything most visitors have ever personally witnessed before. And yet, even those famous, celebrated landscapes would have fit inside the Mammoth Steppe many times over, a comparatively small pocket of open grassland set against a biome that once stretched, essentially without interruption, from the western edge of Europe to the heart of North America. Nothing alive today, anywhere on the planet, comes remotely close to matching that scale, and nothing has, in all the thousands of years since it disappeared. There is one more strange thought worth carrying away from all of this, and it tends to be the one that stays with people the longest after everything else has faded. Ecosystems on this staggering scale are usually assumed, almost automatically, to be permanent, simply because they feel so vast that permanence seems like the only reasonable explanation for something this enormous. The Mammoth Steppe proves that quiet assumption wrong in the most dramatic and unsettling way imaginable. An ecosystem stretching roughly a third of the way around the entire planet, supporting more large mammals per square mile than almost anywhere else on Earth before or since, did not slowly fade into memory over hundreds of thousands of gradual years. It collapsed within a window that, on any true geological timescale, barely even registers as an instant. The animals didn't simply lose their home in some slow, gentle decline. In losing themselves, they took the home down along with them, and no amount of time since has ever been enough to bring any real version of it back. So the next time you happen to glance at a map of the Northern Hemisphere, try picturing it just a little differently than you normally would. Try picturing Britain connected by unbroken grassland all the way across to Siberia, and Siberia connected by dry, walkable land all the way across to Canada, one single, continuous, breathing world instead of the scattered, forested, half-frozen fragments we quietly take for granted today. Somewhere underneath the cities, the farmland, and the forests spread across 3 entire continents, the ground itself still remembers exactly what it once carried on its back. Do you think an ecosystem on that scale could ever exist again on this planet? Or was the Mammoth Steppe something the Earth only ever had one real chance to build? Tell me what you think in the comments.